This is the Late Round Podcast with your host, JJ Zacharisa.
What's up, everyone? It's JJ Zacharisa, the editor-in-chief at FanDuel and at NumberFire.com, and this is episode 515 of the Late Round Podcast, the many shows that are part of the FanDuel Podcast Network. Thanks for tuning in. I know it's earlier than usual in the week for a mailbag episode, but I'm moving. My family and I are staying generally in the same area that we've been in, but we're moving houses, so I'm off at the end of this week to get that move complete. So next week, I'll have a new office, I'll have a new recording space. I'm very excited. But I wanted to get this mailbag episode done before that move takes place. The last episode in the house that I've lived in over the last 6 years. It's kind of bittersweet. Now, before we get into the questions this week, hey, baseball and fantasy fans, FanDuel has a special contest for you running every single day. The FanDuel Home Run Challenge is free to play. All you have to do is draft a team of 3 players and will receive points for each home run that they hit. You can then compete for a chance to win a part of the $10,000 prize pool. For more details, visit FanDuel.com or download the FanDuel app today. Eligibility restrictions apply. Now let's get to these questions. I couldn't do the mailbag episode this week without talking about the Julio Jones trade that went down over the weekend. I got a few questions about how things changed in fantasy, and instead of answering all of those questions individually, I figured I'd just walk through the whole thing. But shout out to @DinoGameTheory, @AndreAmaral633, @JamieHFantasy, and @Chief and Jazz, and a few others who asked questions surrounding the impact of this trade. Let's start with the Titans, who now have Julio Jones. I mentioned on last week's episode that A.J. Brown had a ceiling to be the best wide receiver in fantasy football this year. Adding Julio Jones to the mix hurts that. Because like I said on the show, we typically see those crazy high target share seasons from players when the alternatives in their offenses weren't really there. Now there's an alternative. With that being said, my projections still really like A.J. Brown. He's still the wide receiver 6 in my projections with a little under 140 targets and 90 receptions. And keep in mind, we have a 17-game season now. But my projections still like Brown more than Justin Jefferson and DK Metcalf, just to give you guys some context. And that's with Tennessee being a fairly run-heavy team. I do have them projected with about 32 pass attempts per game this year, which is a little bit higher than what we've seen in recent seasons. But the defense is average, and they added a weapon in Julio Jones that they haven't had before. So I don't think it's illogical to think that they're going to be a little bit more pass heavy. Just a little bit. Now with Julio, I tweeted out immediately after the move that he was my wide receiver 15 in my projections. That's dropped a little bit, and he's now closer to wide receiver 20. That's how much a single percentage in target share can change things. But I do expect him to see a target share in that 24-25% range. And he should be efficient on his targets in the Titans offense. We'll just have to see where his ADP ends up settling at. Nothing really changed drastically for Derrick Henry, and a lot of secondary pass catchers like Anthony Ferguson and Josh Reynolds, they took a hit. But I wouldn't be overly concerned about A.J. Brown. I do think he should drop in rankings just a tad, but this shouldn't destroy him. Meanwhile, Ryan Tannehill is a pretty big winner. When you add Julio Jones to your offense, that tends to happen. My numbers have Tannehill at QB 10 right now. His projection is 0.1 points per game better than Tom Brady's. So Tannehill is firmly in the late round quarterback discussion. With Atlanta, I've talked through some of this on the podcast over the last couple of weeks. Last season, Calvin Ridley's PPR points per game average rose by 3 points when Julio Jones was out. He went from about a 21% target share per game with Jones active to about 30% per game without him. That's why you've seen analysts this week going nuts about Calvin Ridley's upside, because his upside is there. And multiple people hit my mentions this week saying that this is like Juju Smith-Schuster all over again. When Juju lost Antonio Brown, his fantasy value ended up dropping, not rising. But he got plenty of hype after Antonio Brown left Pittsburgh. I don't see that as the case at all. Calvin Ridley has been a perimeter receiver in the NFL. He's had a larger sample size without his alpha teammate too. And in that sample size, he's dominated. Juju Smith-Schuster didn't have the same evidence that we have with Calvin Ridley. So I feel pretty confident that this is not another Juju situation. The 2 wide receivers are totally different players. My projections currently have Ridley at wide receiver 5. And like I said, the ceiling is definitely there for him. He has wide receiver 1 overall in his range of outcomes. Kyle Pitts gets a bump from this move as well. The Falcons are likely going to implement a lot of 2 tight end sets with Arthur Smith there now as head coach, which will also help Hayden Hurst to be more relevant. The Titans have lined up in 12 personnel at one of the highest rates in the league over the last couple of seasons. And I'm referencing the Titans because of Arthur Smith. And according to sharpfootballstats.com, they tied the Eagles last season with the highest 12 personnel frequency across the league. Cap issues aside, Kyle Pitts' versatility is probably a reason the Falcons felt that they could make this move with Julio. So as a result of the move, Pitts went to tight end 5 in my projections. I have the big 3 tight ends and Mark Andrews ahead of him in my projections. But I'm likely going to have Kyle Pitts as my tight end 4 in my rankings, because there's a lot of interesting upside that exists with his insane profile. And then lastly, I want to talk about Russell Gage. I mentioned on last week's show how Gage was really good in games where he played 70% or more of Atlanta's snaps last year. He averaged a 22.5% target share per game in those contests and almost 15 PPR points per game. Outside of those games, the target share dropped by 9 percentage points and the PPR points per game were almost cut in half. One issue that we could run into with Gage is that thus far throughout his career, he's been more of a slot guy. He played 67.5% of his snaps from the slot last year, according to Pro Football Focus, and that number was 67% in 2019 as well. Those were his only 2 relevant seasons in the league. This could be troubling if the Falcons do end up deploying a lot of 12 personnel, which I think they will. Because in that scenario, Gage would be forced to the outside. The thing that's keeping me high enough on Gage, though, is that Atlanta doesn't seem to have many alternatives who would be able to replace him. That's why I think that he's still easy to project with a decent target share. But do keep in mind that if his ADP rises enough to where it gets uncomfortable, or moderately uncomfortable, it's easy to fade him because of how he's been used thus far in his career. I'm not sure he's a special enough talent to assume that he can be a powerhouse on the outside opposite of Calvin Ridley. So Gage is more in that wide receiver 4 range. He's in the 40s in my wide receiver projections. Matt Ryan also dropped in my projections to a mid-range QB2 for the record. The lack of rushing upside hurts players like Matt Ryan. So that's my take on the trade. It's one that really elevated a lot of pieces in fantasy football. This next question is an email. It says, "Hey JJ, I'm struggling to assess Cam Akers' potential to be a bell cow in 2021. What do you think? Thanks, Mike." So Cam Akers missed time at the beginning of the 2020 season, his rookie campaign. He was then sort of eased back into an annoying degree, and then things really shifted for the Rams' backfield in week 13 last year. That's when Cam Akers started seeing a bigger workload after having a big game against the 49ers on limited touches the week prior. From that point on through the playoffs, Akers handled about 87% of the Rams' running back rushes, and he averaged about an 8% target share per game. Now, Darrell Henderson was banged up and out in the final 3 games of that sample size, so that probably skews things at least a little bit. I don't think we should assume Henderson just disappears in 2021, especially with Malcolm Brown gone. But if we're looking at the potential that Akers is a bell cow in 2021, I think that potential is decently high. The Rams used him down the stretch even when Henderson was active. And we can't lose sight of the Rams actually drafting Akers in the first place. They had spent a day 2 pick on Darrell Henderson the year before. And they did that just to spend an even higher pick on Akers the following year. That alone tells you they weren't sold on Henderson being a bell cow back for them. A lot of things point to Akers being that capable player. If you look at last season, 2 of Henderson's biggest 3 running back rush share games, they came when Cam Akers was out. When Cam Akers was in, Henderson wasn't getting the rock nearly as much. Logically, this is telling us that Akers is at the very least the 1A in that offense. And considering what they spent to get him, how good of a prospect he was, and what he did down the stretch last year, it's easy to see him being their bell cow with Henderson being a change of pace player for them. But let's not get it twisted. You have to do some projecting for Cam Akers this season. He's very good, and I think the average draft position for Cam Akers is right. But he's one of those early round players with a very wide range of outcomes. There's a scenario where he jumps into the elite tier this season, given the offense he's in and the workload that he could see. And the talent. Cam Akers is really good, and he scored really well in my model. But be open-minded, because this could go south too. Or at least this could be more of a committee than some expect. That's also in his range of outcomes. I think the opposite is more probable. But let's not pretend that we have this massive sample size of Cam Akers being the team's bell cow with a healthy Darrell Henderson. We don't. You drafting or fading Akers will come down to risk tolerance. I think he's a good bet, and I'm intrigued by his upside. But I can understand if you'd rather play it safe and get an Eckler or a Joe Mixon type instead, because those guys are definitely safer bets. This next question is from Twitter. It says, "Am I crazy to think that Taysom Hill is this year's best bet as late round quarterback? If he is the starter, he should get plenty of rushing yards, a floor of passing yards, and will likely also catch a few passes. Yet I've heard zero fanfare from analysts. You're not crazy at all to think this, but you're also making the assumption that he is the starter. If he were confirmed the starter, you'd hear far more about Taysom Hill in fantasy circles. Quarterback is not like running back or wide receiver. At running back and wide receiver, there aren't really any obvious late round alternatives that you can go for if you don't get one of your favorite late round dart throws. At quarterback, there are. That's part of the reason the late round quarterback strategy can be effective. It's because there's an excess supply of quarterbacks in single quarterback leagues. So because there are alternatives who are locked in as their team starter, people are naturally going to be less into a player like Taysom Hill. But if he's a confirmed starter, his ADP is going to rise. It's just that the equity that you would gain by going all in right now on Taysom Hill is not the same as it would be at running back or wide receiver. Like, think of it this way. Let's say that you've got a late round running back that you've been targeting over and over and over again. He goes in the same round that Taysom Hill goes in. Now let's say in July, he gets named the starter. That running back is now the starter for his team. And there are reports saying that he's going to see a lot of work, and you feel very confident, and everyone feels very confident that he's going to be close to a bell cow. And let's assume that Taysom Hill is named starter at the exact same time. That running back's ADP is going to rise more dramatically than Taysom Hill's will. Because running back matters more in fantasy football. So the ROI that you're getting is more substantial with that running back than it is for Taysom Hill. Because even if Hill is named starter, he's still going to be a low-end QB1 or a high-end QB2. And those players are still being drafted in the middle to late rounds of drafts. Whereas that running back would rise to at least the middle rounds. So hopefully that all makes sense. I agree that Hill is a great late round quarterback if he's named starter. But there's no reason to necessarily totally bank on that right now in June when there are plenty of alternatives at quarterback. And when we know the ADP rise may not be that substantial, at least compared to other positions. This next question is from @LP_Porto. What is your view on Lynn's comment as Jamal Williams as RB1A, and how does that impact Swift on your model? Okay, so I think the comment by Anthony Lynn has been blown a little bit out of proportion. I don't think he was saying that Williams would be the 1A in his offense, just that he's that kind of running back. This was the quote from a few weeks ago. Lynn said, quote, "Jamal is what I'd call a classic A back. I like to break the backs down into A and B. My A backs are normally my bigger backs. They can run between the tackles, block probably a little better than a B back. They can also run the perimeter. I can leave those guys in there for all three downs." So I don't think Lynn is necessarily saying this within the context of the Lions offense. He's saying this within the context of Jamal Williams' skill set, which is a completely different thing. Because hypothetically, he could have multiple A-backs on his team. That would leave some of the A-backs without a 3-down workload. Now, with that being said, and I tweeted about this when the quote was originally said, but I had Jamal Williams projected for a decent-sized workload in that Lions backfield to begin with. Nothing really changed for me based on that quote because it seemed reasonable to think that Swift wouldn't carry the ball 250 plus times. That's not necessarily his game. Now, as it relates to my projections, Swift is my RB14. My view on Swift is pretty straightforward. He should have a good floor for PPR formats given his potential target share, and I'd expect him to catch a lot of passes. But on multiple levels, I worry about the ceiling. I worry about him not seeing all the goal line work. And that's within an offense that's not going to be very good. That combination means I'm probably only going to aggressively go after him in redraft when his ADP falls. I think he's a safe bet to give you some production this year, but with my early round picks, I want them to have that true RB1 ceiling. That's tougher for DeAndre Swift this year given the situation that he's in. But the RB14 to 17 range, that seems about right for DeAndre Swift. So the last question this week sort of answers two questions. It's from @DynastyBennett. Why are so many people down on J.K. Dobbins? 30-year-old Mark Ingram finishes an RB1 in the same offense, and Dobbins is far more explosive. So first off, I would give episode 510 a listen. That goes over the impact that mobile quarterbacks have on their teammates in fantasy football. And historically, teams that have rushing quarterbacks, those rushing quarterbacks impact their running back teammates negatively. Now, clearly that wasn't the case for Mark Ingram 2 years ago when he finishes an RB1. But there are a lot of reasons as to why we shouldn't approach fantasy football in that way. I'm going to combine this question, like I said at the top, with another one that I got this week from @J508-67728. Jay tweeted and said, I feel that, quote, he's the RB5 is misleading and kind of useless. If RB5 is 70 points behind RB4 or 2 points ahead of RB10, who cares? Why can't points scored be the norm? David Montgomery was RB4 in 2020 and scored 237 points. RBs 5 to 6 scored 235 and 234. Dalvin Cook, the RB3, scored 315. Thoughts? Now, the reason I want to combine the two questions is because I think this plays into what you're saying in this question about J.K. Dobbins. Mark Ingram finishes the RB10 in points per game in 2019. Yes. But what does that actually mean? To Jay's point, why aren't we just saying that Ingram scored 16.2 PPR points per game? Because when you give it that context, it doesn't look as good. One RB1 is not the same as another RB1. And one RB1 from one season isn't the same as an RB1 the next season. Just as a quick example, Mark Ingram would have been a high-end RB2 last year in points per game had he continued scoring 16.2 points per game. I made a Twitter thread about this topic last week, actually. One of the things that irritates me most with fantasy analysts is when people say things like, David Montgomery was the RB4 last year, and now he's being drafted as the RB20. He's a steal. But really, there are far better metrics and things to look at than previous season finishes. We know David Montgomery had the backfield to himself, that Tariq Cohen was injured. And we also know that a running back's overall finish can often tell us just as much about his health as his actual performance. Running backs who see big workloads and don't get hurt, they're generally going to score a decent amount of fantasy points. Now, this isn't to say that Montgomery is bad or anything. It's just to say that if you're gonna forecast, you should try your best to look at things that really matter. Like, yeah, there's some correlation between a player's finish one season and his finish the next season. But there are still better ways to go about looking at that. Projections themselves are going to be more accurate than a previous season finish. So the fact that Mark Ingram finishes the RB1 in 2019 doesn't really do anything for me with J.K. Dobbins. We need more than that to work off of. Not only that, but Ingram did what he did in 2019 in a super unsustainable way. This is another thing that often goes unnoticed when we look at finishes and don't give them any context. We're not actually analyzing for things like regression. That season was Lamar Jackson's MVP season. Baltimore was insanely efficient offensively, and they were really good at scoring touchdowns. They scored 58 times on offense. Only 8 teams since 2011 have scored that many touchdowns. That has a trickle-down effect on the rest of the team in fantasy football, and it did for Mark Ingram. That season, Mark Ingram scored 15 touchdowns. According to my method of looking at rushing touchdown regression, he should have scored 8 to 9 touchdowns on the ground when he had 10. So it wasn't a huge deal there from a regression standpoint. But Ingram saw 30 targets that season, and he scored 5 touchdowns through the air. That season, he became the first running back in NFL history to have 30 targets or less while scoring 5 or more touchdowns. So not only was Ingram's RB1 finish a low-end RB1 finish, and not only would it have been a worse finish just a year later, but he did it during an outlier offensive season for Baltimore while having an outlier season as a receiver. And then the other point to make about historical finishes and attributing them to the current year, in the current year, we're working with perfect information. Running back injuries happen all the time. In June, everyone's healthy. So from a rankings and projection front, there's more competition across the league at the position than there might be at the end of the season, or at the end of the previous season. Like Saquon Barkley was hurt last year. He's not hurt this year. That's more in added competition. And then the running back position also has a lot of young players with potential from that 2020 class. That includes J.K. Dobbins, but Cam Akers, Antonio Gibson, Jonathan Taylor, Clyde Edwards-Helaire. There's a lot of competition right now at the running back position. That competition at the end of the year may not exist in the same way because injuries are going to occur. So when we look at a previous season finish, we're looking at players who are competing against a sort of weaker competition than they're competing with in June or July. Because in the summer, everyone's healthy and they're projected to be healthy. So there are a lot of reasons to be down on J.K. Dobbins and to not just assume that he can be an RB1 because Ingram was an RB1 2 years ago. We can't lock in the Ravens to have one of the best offensive seasons in NFL history. We can't assume J.K. Dobbins is an outlier season catching touchdown passes. Competition at running back across the league is better right now than it was in 2019. And that makes it tougher then to be an RB1. Mobile quarterbacks generally don't help their teammates in fantasy too. And Dobbins himself and the Ravens running back since Lamar Jackson took over to that point, they've had really bad receiving volume and target shares. Now, I don't necessarily mind J.K. Dobbins. I'm more so poking holes in the logic that was used here because I think it's really, really important. Ingram being a 30-year-old RB1 in that Ravens offense, that has nothing to do with how good of a fantasy asset J.K. Dobbins is going to be this year. My projections right now have J.K. Dobbins at RB19, and I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think it's where he should be drafted this season. That's going to do it for today's show, though. Thanks to all of you for listening. If you've yet subscribed to the Late Round Podcast, make sure you are by searching for it pretty much anywhere podcasts can be found. And don't forget to follow me on Twitter at LateRoundQB. Thanks for listening this week, everyone. I'll talk to you next week.